Picture this. For centuries, historians swore the mighty Library of Alexandria burned in a single catastrophic fire, wiping out the ancient world's greatest knowledge in one night. The image is dramatic flames consuming priceless scrolls, humanity's collective wisdom vanishing in smoke. But here's the shocking truth: that story, it's almost entirely wrong. The library didn't fall in one fiery moment. It faded slowly, victim not to a single conqueror's torch, but to centuries of neglect, political turmoil, and smaller, scattered acts of destruction. This myth persisted for over 2,000 years, repeated by scholars and teachers alike, until modern historians pieced together the far messier and far more human truth. And that's just the beginning. History, as we know it, is built on layers of mistakes, assumptions, and sometimes outright fabrications that even the most respected experts once accepted as fact. Think about that. The past isn't some fixed, unchanging thing. It's a puzzle constantly being reassembled, where new discoveries can shatter what we thought we knew overnight. From misplaced artifacts to mistranslated texts, from biases that colored entire eras to hoaxes that fooled generations, the record is full of corrections waiting to happen. That's why today we're diving into 30 times historians were proven wrong. These aren't just minor tweaks to timelines or spelling errors in old documents. These are seismic shifts, moments where whole chapters of the human story had to be rewritten. You'll meet forgotten civilizations that were dismissed as legend until their ruins stared us in the face. You'll see how one stubborn scholar's doubt can overturn centuries of belief. And you'll discover how even today, with all our technology and tools, we're still uncovering truths that force us to rethink everything. So buckle up, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what we think happened and how often we've had to admit we got it all wrong. Here's one of history's most stubborn myths: the idea that medieval people thought the earth was flat. You've probably heard it 100 times. Brave explorers like Columbus defied the ignorant masses who feared sailing off the edge of the world. But here's the twist: that story, it's almost entirely fake. The truth is, educated scholars in the Middle Ages knew the earth was round. Ancient Greek mathematicians had calculated its curvature centuries earlier, and that knowledge never truly disappeared. Even medieval textbooks included diagrams of a spherical earth. So where did this flat earth myth come from? Blame the 19th century. Writers like Washington Irving, yes, the guy who invented the headless horseman, spun dramatic tales of superstitious peasants clashing with enlightened explorers. These stories weren't history, they were propaganda designed to paint the past as backward and the modern age as superior. But the real scandal isn't just that we got the Middle Ages wrong, it's how long this myth stuck around. For generations, textbooks repeated it, pop culture cemented it. Even today, you'll hear echoes of it in movies and jokes. Yet the evidence was always there, hiding in plain sight. Medieval astronomers used globes. Church scholars debated the antipodes, not the edge of the world. Even Dante's Divine Comedy, one of the era's most famous works, describes a spherical earth. So why did we believe the lie for so long? Because sometimes a good story outweighs the facts. We wanted to believe in progress, in the heroic march of science over superstition. But history isn't that simple. The real lesson here: every time we assume people in the past were fools, we're usually the ones missing the bigger picture. And this myth's persistence reveals something deeper about how history gets rewritten. One exaggerated tale, repeated enough times, can drown out centuries of scholarship. It takes stubborn historians digging through old manuscripts to set the record straight, to remind us that the past was always more complicated, more curious, and far more intelligent than we give it credit for. So the next time someone jokes about falling off the edge of the world, you'll know the truth. The flat earth myth isn't medieval history, it's ours. Think of a Viking and what comes to mind? Chances are it's a fearsome warrior with a horned helmet roaring into battle. That iconic image has been stamped onto everything from comic books to football team logos. But here's the jaw-dropping reality. Vikings didn't wear horned helmets, not in battle, not ever. So how did this myth become so deeply embedded in our culture? The answer takes us not to the Viking Age, but to the 19th century, a time when Europe was obsessed with reinventing the past to suit its own nationalistic fantasies. The whole horned helmet craze traces back to an unlikely source: opera. In 1876, composer Richard Wagner staged his epic Ring Cycle, a sweeping drama about Norse gods and heroes. The costume designer Carl Emil Doppler decided to deck out the Viking characters with horned helmets, not because they were historically accurate, but because they looked dramatic under stage lights. Audiences loved it, the image stuck. Soon, artists and writers ran with the idea, turning Wagner's theatrical flourish into historical fact. Nationalist movements across Europe latched onto these romanticized Vikings as symbols of pure, ancient warrior spirit. Never mind that actual Viking helmets were simple, practical iron caps designed to deflect blows, not display decorative horns that could catch a sword mid-swing. But here's where it gets even stranger. Archaeologists have dug up hundreds of Viking graves and settlements. Not a single horned battle helmet has ever been found. The closest we've come are a few ceremonial helmets with animal motifs, likely used for rituals, not combat. Real Viking warriors knew better. In a shield wall, where one wrong move could mean death, having protruding horns would be suicidal. They'd snag on weapons, unbalance the wearer, or worse, give an enemy something to grab onto. Yet despite the evidence, the myth thrived. Why? Because it fed into a larger narrative. The 19th century wanted Vikings to be wild, pagan, and larger than life, not the sophisticated traders, explorers, and craftsmen they really were. This myth's endurance reveals something fascinating about how history gets hijacked. Once an idea enters popular culture, it's incredibly hard to dislodge, even when the facts scream otherwise. Schools taught it, museums displayed fake replicas, Hollywood cemented it, and somewhere along the way, the real Vikings, the ones who sailed to North America, built intricate legal systems and traded from Baghdad to Greenland, got overshadowed by a costume designer's whimsical choice. So the next time you see a horned helmet, remember, history isn't just about what was, it's also about what we wanted to believe. And sometimes the most persistent myths are the ones that tell us more about our own fantasies than the past they claim to represent. Napoleon Bonaparte stands as one of history's most iconic figures, a military genius who reshaped Europe. But there's one thing everyone thinks they know about him: he was ridiculously short. The phrase Napoleon complex even entered our vocabulary, describing someone overcompensating for their small stature. But here's the twist: Napoleon wasn't short at all. In fact, he was perfectly average for his time. So how did this myth take such deep root? The answer lies in a mix of propaganda, measurement confusion, and a dash of historical irony. Let's start with the numbers. French records from the early 19th century list Napoleon's height as 5'2". That sounds tiny by today's standards until you realize those measurements were in French feet, which were longer than English feet. Converted, Napoleon stood around 5'6" or 7", smack in the middle of the average height for French men of his era. His soldiers weren't towering over him. His rivals weren't looking down literally or figuratively. So why did the myth persist? Enter the British. During the Napoleonic Wars, British cartoonists and writers seized on the idea of Little Boney, depicting him as a petulant child stomping across Europe. It was brilliant psychological warfare, reducing their formidable enemy to a figure of ridicule. And it worked so well that even 2 centuries later, we still picture Napoleon as the short guy with something to prove. But the real irony, Napoleon was often surrounded by his elite imperial guard, handpicked for their imposing stature. Next to these exceptionally tall soldiers, he appeared shorter, fueling the misconception. Meanwhile, his contemporaries like Tsar Alexander I and the Duke of Wellington were roughly the same height, yet nobody remembers them as abnormally small. That's the power of a well-crafted narrative. Once the British press latched onto the idea, it stuck, drowning out the reality. This myth's endurance reveals how easily history can be reshaped by perception. We remember Napoleon as short because it served a story, one about ambition, insecurity, and the underdog. But the truth, he was a man of average height who cast an enormous shadow. And that's the ultimate lesson here. History isn't just about facts, it's about which facts we choose to emphasize and which ones we twist to fit the tale we want to tell. We've all heard the term Dark Ages, a 1,000-year gap between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, painted as a time of ignorance, superstition, and cultural collapse. But what if that entire narrative is wrong? Modern historians are tearing apart this outdated idea, revealing a period not of darkness but of quiet brilliance. The so-called Dark Ages were anything but stagnant. Behind the scenes, medieval scholars were making breakthroughs that would lay the groundwork for the modern world. Take science, for example. While popular imagination pits medieval Europe as a place where people feared the stars, the reality was far more sophisticated. Scholars in monasteries meticulously preserved and translated ancient Greek and Roman texts, blending them with new discoveries. The 9th century monk Alcuin of York revolutionized education under Charlemagne, creating a curriculum that included mathematics, astronomy, and logic. And let's not forget Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who wrote groundbreaking works on medicine, botany, and even cosmology, proving that scientific curiosity wasn't just alive, it was thriving. Then there's architecture. The soaring cathedrals of the Middle Ages weren't just feats of devotion, they were marvels of engineering. Craftsmen mastered the use of flying buttresses and ribbed vaults, techniques so advanced they defied gravity itself. The Notre Dame de Paris, begun in the 12th century, stood as a testament to mathematical precision and artistic vision. These weren't the works of a backward society. They were the blueprints of a civilization pushing boundaries. Even philosophy flourished. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas wrestled with questions of reason and faith, crafting arguments that would shape Western thought for centuries. Universities in Bologna, Oxford, and Paris became hubs of debate, where law, theology, and natural philosophy were studied with rigor. The medieval world wasn't a desert of ideas, it was a crossroads where ancient wisdom met innovative thinking. So why did the Dark Ages myth persist for so long? Blame the Renaissance. Later scholars, eager to glorify their own era, painted the Middle Ages as a bleak interlude between classical brilliance and their own enlightenment. It was a storytelling trick, a way to make their achievements seem even more dazzling by contrast. But history isn't a zero-sum game. Recognizing the medieval period's contributions doesn't diminish the Renaissance, it enriches our understanding of how knowledge evolves. The truth is, the Dark Ages were only dark if you weren't looking closely. Beneath the surface, this was a time of quiet revolution where scribes, builders, and thinkers kept the flame of progress burning. Next time you hear someone dismiss the Middle Ages as a cultural wasteland, remember, some of history's brightest sparks were kindled in what we once called the dark. History textbooks have long painted Christopher Columbus as the fearless explorer who discovered America in 1492, bravely sailing into the unknown to reveal a new world. But that story crumbles under scrutiny. The truth, Columbus wasn't the first to reach the Americas. He wasn't even close. Long before his ships ever touched Caribbean shores, this hemisphere was already a bustling network of sophisticated civilizations, and evidence suggests others had crossed the ocean centuries before him. Take the Vikings for starters. Roughly 500 years before Columbus, Norse explorer Leif Erikson established a settlement in Newfoundland at a site we now call Elance Oaks Meadows. Archaeologists unearthed Viking artifacts there: iron nails, wooden structures, even evidence of boat repair, proving these seafarers not only reached North America but stayed long enough to leave a mark. And they weren't just fleeting visitors. Sagas like the Greenlandic and Eric the Red's describe entire expeditions, complete with trade and clashes with indigenous peoples. Yet this fact was dismissed as legend until physical evidence forced historians to rewrite the narrative. But the Vikings weren't the only pre-Columbian voyagers. Polynesian sailors, master navigators of the Pacific, likely reached South America centuries earlier. How do we know sweet potatoes, a crop native to the Americas, were being grown in Polynesia by the year 1000? Genetic studies confirm these weren't separate strains. They were transplants carried across thousands of miles of open ocean. And then there's the chicken bones found in Chile, dating to around 1350, which traced their DNA back to Polynesian poultry. These weren't accidents. They were traces of deliberate, skilled exploration that defies the myth of a lost world waiting for Europe to stumble upon it. And let's not forget the indigenous civilizations themselves. The idea that Columbus discovered America ignores the tens of millions already living there: societies like the Maya, with their staggering astronomical knowledge, or the Inca, who built an empire spanning mountains without the wheel. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was larger and cleaner than any European city of its time, with canals, zoos, and aqueducts that left Spanish conquistadors gaping. Columbus didn't find an empty wilderness. He arrived in a hemisphere that had been thriving for millennia. So why does the Columbus myth persist? Because history is often written by the winners. European powers had a vested interest in framing the New World as uncharted territory ripe for conquest, acknowledging pre-existing connections, or worse, advanced indigenous societies undermined their claims to dominance. It took centuries for scholarship to peel back those layers of bias, revealing a world far more interconnected than we'd been taught. The real lesson here isn't just about who got there first. It's about how easily a single version of events can erase entire chapters of human achievement. Columbus's voyage was significant, but it wasn't unique, and recognizing that doesn't diminish history. It enriches it, revealing a past where curiosity and courage weren't confined to one continent or culture. The next time you hear someone credit Columbus with discovering America, remember, the truth is always more complicated and more fascinating than the myth. Neanderthals have long been the punching bags of prehistory, hunched, grunting brutes dragged across cave floors in cartoons and pop culture. But what if everything you've been taught about them is wrong? Modern science has turned this outdated stereotype on its head, revealing a species far more sophisticated, creative, and even familiar than we ever imagined. These weren't mindless cavemen. They were inventors, artists, and even family. Start with their brains. Neanderthal skulls show they had larger cranial capacities than modern humans. That's right, bigger brains. They crafted complex tools like multi-part spears and adhesive tar from birch bark, a process requiring precise temperature control and planning. They weren't just smashing rocks together. They were engineering solutions to survival. In Croatia, archaeologists found a Neanderthal-made rope tool so advanced it took modern researchers years to replicate the technique. These weren't the actions of primitive thugs. They were the marks of problem solvers. Then there's the art. For decades, cave paintings were credited solely to Homo sapiens, proof of our superior creativity. But in Spain, red ochre designs in La Pasiega cave hand stencils and ladder-like patterns date back 64,000 years, a time when Neanderthals were Europe's sole inhabitants. Even more striking, eagle talons found in Croatia were strung as jewelry, and a deer bone from Germany bears an intricate carved hashtag design. These weren't doodles. They were expressions of symbolism, a trait once thought uniquely human. But the most jaw-dropping revelation, they're still part of us. Genetic testing shows most people of non-African descent carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. That means our ancestors didn't just encounter them, they loved them, had children with them. Far from being wiped out by superior humans, Neanderthals merged into our family tree. Some of their genes even gave us advantages like immune system boosts or adaptations to colder climates. So why did the dumb brute myth stick for so long? Blame early 20th century interpretations that framed Neanderthals as evolutionary failures, stooped and savage compared to our refined lineage. Reconstructions exaggerated their brow ridges and posture, playing into colonial-era biases that equated physical differences with inferiority. It took DNA sequencing and advanced archaeology to strip away those prejudices, showing a species that thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, only to be written off by the very descendants who carried their legacy. The truth is, Neanderthals weren't lesser, they were different. They buried their dead with flowers, they cared for their sick and elderly. They might have even had language, given their hyoid bone structure matches ours. Their story isn't one of stupidity or extinction, it's a reminder that intelligence wears many faces. And perhaps the most humbling lesson of all, for all our assumptions about being the pinnacle of evolution, we're just one chapter in a much richer, messier, and more interconnected human story. The Salem Witch Trials weren't just a case of mass hysteria, they were a perfect storm of fear, politics, and even climate change. For generations, the story went like this: superstitious Puritans, whipped into a frenzy by religious fanaticism, accused their neighbors of witchcraft in a fit of irrational panic. But modern historians have unearthed a far more complex web of causes, revealing how social tensions, economic rivalries, and even a little ice age collided to create one of history's most infamous chapters. Start with the land disputes. Salem Village in 1692 was a community divided literally. Wealthy families on the eastern side, with prime farmland and ties to the bustling port of Salem town, clashed with poorer western families struggling on rocky soil. When accusations began flying, they followed these fault lines. The first three women accused Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, were outsiders in every sense: a Caribbean enslaved woman, a homeless beggar, and an elderly woman tangled in inheritance disputes with her own stepchildren. The pattern held as accusations spread. Wealthier families accused poorer neighbors. Long-standing grudges over property lines and unpaid debts suddenly took on a supernatural sheen. This wasn't random panic, it was a weaponization of fear to settle old scores. Then there's the Puritan theocracy. Ministers like Cotton Mather had spent years warning of Satan's growing influence, pointing to recent disasters, smallpox outbreaks, failed harvests, and attacks by Native Americans as signs of divine punishment. When a group of girls began having violent fits, the explanation was obvious. The devil had infiltrated Salem, but here's what's often overlooked: these girls weren't powerless victims. Their accusations gave them unprecedented social power in a society where young women were meant to be silent and obedient. Suddenly, their words could topple landowners, humiliate ministers, and even send their enemies to the gallows. The trials became a perverse equalizer, upending the very hierarchy Puritan society held sacred. But perhaps the most surprising factor, the weather. The late 17th century fell in the grip of the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that brought brutal winters and failed crops to New England. Tree ring data shows 1692 was particularly dire, a year of frosts in July and withered harvests. Famine breeds desperation, and desperation breeds scapegoats. Historians now see the witch trials as part of a broader pattern across Europe and America, where climate-induced suffering sparked waves of supernatural blame. When people couldn't explain why God would punish them with starvation, witchcraft offered an answer and a target. So why does the mass hysteria myth persist? Because it's simpler, it lets us dismiss Salem as a bizarre outlier, a product of primitive thinking, but the truth is messier and more human. The witch trials weren't just about fear. They were about power, who had it, who wanted it, and how far they'd go to keep it. They remind us that when societies fracture under pressure, the first casualties are often the vulnerable. And perhaps most chillingly, they show how easily justice can become a tool for settling scores, a lesson that echoes far beyond 17th century Salem. Early British colonists called it terra nullius, nobody's land, a vast, empty interior ripe for claiming. But Australia's heart was never vacant. For over 65,000 years, indigenous Australians shaped every inch of that landscape through intricate fire management, sophisticated farming, and nomadic routes that followed seasonal abundance. What Europeans saw as wilderness was actually a carefully curated ecosystem, maintained by generations of First Nations peoples who knew the land's rhythms better than any outsider ever could. Take fire stick farming, a practice perfected over millennia. Aboriginal communities deliberately burned underbrush in controlled cycles, preventing catastrophic wildfires while encouraging new growth that attracted game. These weren't random acts, they were precise ecological interventions, creating patchworks of grasslands that sustained kangaroos and other prey. European settlers, oblivious to this system, misinterpreted the open landscapes as untouched, never realizing they were walking through human-made gardens. The result, when indigenous fire management was disrupted, Australia faced devastating wildfires of a scale previously unknown, a tragic reminder of what happens when millennia of wisdom are ignored. Then there's the myth of nomadism. Colonists assumed indigenous Australians simply wandered aimlessly. In truth, their movements followed elaborate seasonal calendars tied to water sources, migratory animals, and flowering plants. Networks of wells carved into rock over generations dotted arid regions like the Western Desert. Songlines, oral maps woven into stories and songs guided travelers across thousands of miles with pinpoint accuracy. These weren't survival tactics, they were masterclasses in sustainable living, perfected in one of the planet's harshest environments. Perhaps most astonishing are the remnants of agriculture. Near the town of Brewarina, fish traps built from stones form complex weirs across the Barwon River, funneling catches into pools for harvest. Estimates suggest they've been in use for 40,000 years, making them some of the oldest human-built structures on Earth. Further south, the Gunditjmara people farmed eels in engineered wetlands, complete with stone channels and smoking huts for preservation. These weren't hunter-gatherers. They were aquaculturists managing food systems with foresight colonial accounts never acknowledged. So why did the empty land myth persist? Because admitting the truth would have undermined the colonial project. If the interior was already inhabited, managed, and owned, then claiming it as terra nullius wasn't just inaccurate, it was theft. The fiction allowed settlers to justify displacement, framing indigenous Australians as primitive wanderers rather than the land's rightful custodians. Even today, textbooks often gloss over these advanced systems, reducing 65,000 years of innovation to footnotes, but the evidence is undeniable. From the fish traps of Brewarina to the fire-scarred trees that still bear marks of ancient burns, Australia's landscape is an archive of indigenous genius. The real emptiness wasn't the land, it was the colonists' understanding of it. And that's the deeper tragedy here, not just the erasure of history, but the ecological consequences of ignoring it. When we dismiss the past as primitive, we don't just rewrite history, we lose the very knowledge that could help us face the future. History books love to paint Japan's Edo period as a hermit kingdom, a nation sealed off from the world, frozen in time until American gunships forced it open in 1853. But that image of total isolation, it's a myth. While Japan's Tokugawa shogunate did restrict foreign influence, the country was never truly closed. Behind the official policy of Sakoku, literally closed country, flowed a bustling underground current of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that historians overlooked for centuries. Take Dejima, the tiny artificial island in Nagasaki harbor. For over 200 years, this was the only place Europeans could legally trade with Japan. But only doesn't mean barely. The Dutch East India Company funneled silks, spices, and scientific knowledge through this pinprick of land, while Japanese scholars eagerly devoured Western texts on medicine, astronomy, and even electricity, all smuggled past shogunal censors under the guise of Dutch studies. The shoguns knew they tolerated it because Dejima acted as a pressure valve, letting just enough outside air in to prevent stagnation without threatening their control. And the Dutch weren't alone. Chinese merchants operated under similar restrictions in Nagasaki, trading everything from porcelain to sugar in volumes that would shock anyone who believes Japan turned inward entirely. Even the Ainu, indigenous people of Hokkaido, maintained vibrant trade networks with the mainland, exchanging salmon and furs for rice and iron, a cross-cultural exchange the shogunate quietly sanctioned despite its isolationist rhetoric. Then there's the hidden world of Rangoku, Dutch learning. While the shoguns banned Christian missionaries, they allowed translations of Western anatomy textbooks. Surgeons like Hanaoka Seishu combined Dutch medical diagrams with traditional techniques to perform the world's first successful breast cancer surgery under general anesthesia in 1804, decades before the West adopted the practice. The telescope, introduced via Dejima, revolutionized Japanese astronomy, leading to precise lunar calendars that farmers still relied on. Isolation hardly. This was selective engagement, with Japan cherry-picking the innovations it wanted while keeping destabilizing influences at bay. So why did the closed country myth take hold? Because it suited both sides. Western powers, eager to justify their incursions, framed Japan as backward for resisting progress. Meanwhile, the Tokugawa shogunate exaggerated its isolation to project control, even as regional lords secretly traded with Korea and the Ryukyu kingdom. The truth is, Japan wasn't asleep during the Edo period. It was carefully curating its awakening. And when Perry's black ships finally arrived, they didn't so much open Japan as tip over a domino that was already wobbling. The real story here isn't about isolation versus openness. It's about power, who gets to control the flow of ideas, and how societies protect their identity while still evolving. Japan's Edo period wasn't a blank page waiting for the West to write on it. It was a masterpiece of calculated balance, proving that sometimes the most interesting histories happen not in total seclusion, but in the spaces between. The fall of Rome wasn't the apocalyptic clash of civilizations we've been sold. Forget the image of shrieking barbarians smashing marble columns while toga-clad senators flee in terror. The real story is far more nuanced, a slow dance of migration, negotiation, and cultural blending that reshaped Europe without ever needing a single catastrophic fall. For centuries, historians framed Rome's decline as a morality tale, decadent empire crushed by primitive invaders, but archaeology and fresh readings of ancient texts reveal a startling truth. The so-called barbarians weren't just destroyers. Many were Rome's allies, neighbors, and even part of its military backbone long before the empire's western half dissolved. Take the Goths, often cast as the ultimate villains in Rome's collapse. In 376, when the Huns pushed them into Roman territory, the Goths didn't arrive with swords drawn. They asked for asylum. Emperor Valens, seeing an opportunity to recruit hardy soldiers, allowed them to settle badly. Roman officials exploited the refugees, trading dog meat for Gothic children as slaves. The Goths rebelled not because they hated Rome, but because Rome broke its promises. Their victory at Adrianople wasn't a barbarian onslaught. It was the revolt of fed-up refugees outmaneuvering an arrogant empire on its own turf. And here's what textbooks gloss over. By then, barbarians were already entwined with Rome. Germanic generals like Stilicho and Arbogast commanded Roman legions. The Visigoth king Theodoric ruled Italy from Ravenna, not as a conqueror, but as a Roman-appointed viceroy who preserved Latin bureaucracy, repaired aqueducts, and even threw chariot races. The invaders weren't erasing Roman culture, they were competing to inherit it. When Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor in 476, he didn't declare the empire dead. He sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople, acknowledging that there was still only one Roman world. He just happened to run its Western office now. The real shift was cultural, not catastrophic. Latin didn't vanish, it evolved into Romance languages. Roman law lived on in Germanic codes. Churches built by Goths and Franks mimicked Roman basilicas. Even the famed barbarian kingdoms of Visigothic Spain, Frankish Gaul boasted Roman-style tax collectors and Latin poets at court. The difference: power had decentralized, not disappeared. Roads still carried traders, farms still fed cities. The Dark Ages weren't some post-Roman wasteland. They were the slow simmer of a new Europe, blending traditions in the empire's long shadow. So why does the barbarian horde myth persist? Because it's dramatic. It fits a tidy narrative of rise and fall, civilization versus savagery, but history is rarely that binary. The people we call barbarians weren't outsiders crashing Rome's gates. They'd been part of the story for centuries: soldiers, farmers, refugees, and eventually kings. The fall of Rome wasn't a death, it was a metamorphosis, and that's the real lesson here. Sometimes what looks like an ending is just a messy, complicated, and utterly human beginning. Ancient Egypt endures in our imagination as a monolithic civilization, unchanging pyramids, eternal pharaohs, and a culture frozen in time like the artifacts in its tombs. But peel back the golden veneer, and you'll find a society pulsing with upheaval, reinvention, and messy human drama. The real Egypt wasn't a static monument. It was a revolving door of dynastic feuds, technological leaps, and cultural collisions that historians once brushed aside in favor of cleaner, grander narratives. Consider the Amarna period, one of history's most radical religious revolutions. Around 1350 BCE, Pharaoh Akhenaten didn't just tweak the pantheon, he tore it down. Overnight, he replaced Egypt's millennia-old gods with a single deity, the sun disk Aten, moving the capital to a barren stretch of desert called Amarna. Art transformed too, trading idealized forms for startling realism: elongated faces, sagging bellies. Even the king depicted mid-kiss with his queen, Nefertiti. This wasn't the timeless Egypt of postcards. It was a cultural earthquake so disruptive that after Akhenaten's death, his successors chiseled his name from monuments, pretending the heresy never happened. Then there's the Hyksos, a foreign dynasty that ruled northern Egypt for over a century, long dismissed as barbarian usurpers. Early archaeologists framed their reign as a dark interlude, but digs at Avaris tell a different story. The Hyksos didn't just conquer, they innovated. They introduced the chariot, revolutionizing Egyptian warfare. Their ceilings show a blend of Egyptian and Levantine motifs, proving cultural exchange, not just conflict. When native pharaohs like Ahmose finally expelled them, they didn't erase these advances, they absorbed them, turning Hyksos weapons into tools of empire. Even the pyramids weren't immune to change. The shift from step pyramids to smooth-sided marvels like those at Giza wasn't inevitable, it was trial and error. At Meidum, one early pyramid collapsed mid-construction, its rubble still visible today. At Bent Pyramid, engineers abruptly changed the angle halfway up, creating a humpbacked oddity. These mistakes reveal a society constantly refining its techniques, not just repeating ancient blueprints. And let's not forget the Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, black rulers from Kush who conquered Egypt in the 8th century BCE. Earlier scholars labeled them as outsiders, but they embraced Egyptian customs while adding their own flourishes like the distinctive double uraeus crown. symbolizing rule over both lands. Their reign wasn't a footnote, it was a renaissance, reviving monumental construction and art after years of decline. So why did the unchanging Egypt myth persist? Because stability sells, colonial-era Egyptologists preferred a narrative of eternal splendor, something to contrast with chaotic African and Near Eastern neighbors. But the truth is far richer. From power struggles that would shame Game of Thrones to technological trades with Mesopotamia and the Aegean, Egypt was never a closed loop. It was a living, adapting civilization, one that reshaped itself as often as it reshaped the world. The real wonder isn't that Egypt lasted 3,000 years. It's that it stayed vibrant by never standing still. The Middle Ages weren't a stagnant monolith, they were a whirlwind of innovation, cultural exchange, and regional diversity that defies the stale stereotype of a dark or uniform era. Picture this: while one region perfected Gothic cathedrals, another pioneered windmills. While some kingdoms clung to feudalism, others buzzed with bustling trade cities where merchants dealt in silks from China and spices from India. The medieval world wasn't just alive, it was vibrantly interconnected. Take technology. The 12th century invention of the heavy plow revolutionized agriculture, turning Europe's dense northern soils into breadbaskets. Watermills, once rare, spread like wildfire, harnessing rivers to grind grain, forge iron, and even power early industrial processes. By 1300, mechanical clocks ticked in town squares, a marvel of precision that put ancient sundials to shame. These weren't the toys of isolated villages, they were the building blocks of a continent on the move. Then there's the myth of isolation. Medieval Europe wasn't a walled garden. Viking traders navigated rivers to Baghdad, swapping furs for Arabic silver coins now found buried from Ireland to Russia. The Mongol Empire's postal system, the Yam, stretched from Hungary to Korea, enabling diplomats, merchants, and even a Franciscan friar like William of Rubruck to cross continents safely. In Spain, Toledo became a translation hub where Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars collaborated, preserving Greek philosophy lost to the West and advancing mathematics with Arabic numerals. And let's shatter the idea of cultural uniformity. Compare the Italian city-states where republican ideals simmered to the Byzantine Empire's intricate bureaucracy, or the Icelandic Althing, a parliamentary assembly where free men debated laws as early as 930. Even feudalism, often painted as a rigid system, flexed wildly across regions. In England, the Domesday Book meticulously recorded landholdings for taxation. In Scandinavia, local assemblies settled disputes with collective decision-making. The real irony, many so-called medieval innovations outlasted the era itself. Universities in Bologna and Paris laid the groundwork for modern academia. Bankers in Florence invented double-entry bookkeeping. Gothic architects, with their flying buttresses and stained glass, achieved engineering feats that still awe us today. The Middle Ages didn't just bridge antiquity and the Renaissance. They forged tools, ideas, and institutions that shaped the modern world. So why did the unchanging myth stick? Because later generations, enamored with classical antiquity and the Renaissance, dismissed the centuries in between as a backward interruption. But scratch the surface and you'll find an era pulsing with creativity, curiosity, and connection. A reminder that progress isn't linear and history's so-called dark ages often shine brightest when we look closely. The American Revolution wasn't the foregone conclusion we've been taught to believe. Flip through any textbook and you'll find a tidy arc, oppressive British rule, united colonial outrage, and an inevitable march to independence. But history rarely unfolds so neatly. The reality, many colonists saw themselves as fiercely loyal British subjects right up to the brink of war and even after. Others desperately sought compromise, clinging to the hope that the empire could reform rather than rupture. The revolution wasn't destiny, It was the messy, improbable result of 1,000 small choices, any one of which could have derailed it entirely. Take the Stamp Act crisis of 1765. While Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty rallied mobs to burn effigies of tax collectors, a quieter faction, led by Benjamin Franklin, lobbied London for measured reform, not rebellion. Franklin testified before Parliament, arguing that Americans would accept internal taxes if granted representation. Even John Adams, years before declaring independence, defended British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, insisting fair trials mattered more than partisan rage. The colonies weren't a monolith of revolutionary fervor. They were a patchwork of competing loyalties, with some elites fearing rebellion would unleash chaos worse than taxation. Then there's the Olive Branch Petition of 1775, a last-ditch plea for peace sent by the Continental Congress even as militias clashed with redcoats at Lexington and Concord. Over 40% of delegates opposed independence at that point, including Pennsylvania's John Dickinson, who famously refused to sign the Declaration. Had King George III shown even slight flexibility, offering colonial seats in Parliament or repealing the coercive acts, the war might have fizzled before it began. Instead, his dismissal radicalized moderates, turning a rebellion into a revolution. Contingency, not inevitability, ruled the moment. Historians still spar over how close things came to unfolding differently. What if William Pitt the Elder's proposal for virtual representation had passed? Could a more diplomatic royal governor have cooled tensions in Massachusetts? Even military outcomes hinged on luck. A foggy night let Washington escape Brooklyn in 1776. A stray bullet might have killed him at Princeton. These weren't minor footnotes, they were hinges of history, any one of which could have bent the story toward reconciliation or collapse. The myth of inevitability does more than oversimplify. It erases the real fear and division that gripped the colonies. Thousands of loyalists fled to Canada rather than renounce the crown. Native nations like the Iroquois Confederacy split over which side to back, aware that independence might doom their land claims. An enslaved people like Crispus Attucks, whose death in the Boston Massacre made him a martyr, faced a bitter paradox, fighting for a liberty that wouldn't include them. The revolution wasn't a tidal wave. It was a knife's-edge balance tilted by accidents, personalities, and the relentless weight of human uncertainty. So why does the myth persist? Because revolutions need founding myths. A story of unified patriots marching toward freedom is more inspiring than the truth. A fractured society stumbling toward a future none could fully predict. But recognizing that contingency doesn't diminish the revolution, it humanizes it. The men who debated in Philadelphia weren't prophets seeing decades ahead. They were gamblers guessing in the dark, and that's the real lesson here. History isn't written by destiny. It's written by people in all their doubt, courage, and imperfect choices. For centuries, Western historians dismissed the Byzantine Empire as a rotting relic, a sad, shrinking shadow of Rome, drowning in court intrigues and gold-encrusted decadence. But that caricature couldn't be further from the truth. Byzantium wasn't some stagnant backwater. It was a military powerhouse, a cultural lighthouse, and an economic juggernaut that outlasted every rival for 1,000 years. How did a civilization branded as weak survive constant invasions, religious schisms, and even the bubonic plague? By being tougher, smarter, and more adaptable than its critics ever admitted. Start with the military genius. While medieval Europe fractured into feuding kingdoms, Byzantium perfected the art of defense. Its legendary walls withstood 26 sieges, including the Arab assaults of the 7th and 8th centuries that toppled empires like Persia. But this wasn't just about bricks and mortar. The Byzantines pioneered psychological warfare. Greek fire, a napalm-like liquid that burned on water, sent enemy fleets fleeing in terror. Their spy networks stretched from Baghdad to the steppes, gathering intel decades before the term intelligence agency existed. and their generals wrote treatises on strategy so advanced that modern militaries still study them. This wasn't decay, it was survival honed to a science. Then there's the economy. While Western Europe bartered with chickens, Constantinople buzzed with a currency so stable it became the dollar of the medieval world. The gold solidus, minted for 700 years without debasement, funded everything from silk trade routes to China to the construction of the Hagia Sophia, a dome so audacious it defied physics for centuries. Byzantine merchants dominated the Black Sea, supplying furs from Russia, spices from India, and amber from the Baltic. Even after losing half its territory, the empire's tax system and bureaucracy ran with Swiss watch precision, funneling wealth into hospitals, universities, and the world's first recorded social welfare programs. Culturally, Byzantium was anything but stagnant. Its scholars preserved ancient Greek texts that would later fuel the Renaissance, while its artists invented the shimmering mosaics and iconography that defined Eastern Orthodox Christianity. The University of Constantinople, founded in 842, taught philosophy, medicine, and astronomy while Europe's monasteries struggled with basic literacy. And let's not forget the legal legacy. Emperor Justinian's code became the bedrock of European law, shaping concepts we still live by today, from property rights to presumptive innocence. So why the bad reputation? Blame centuries of Western bias. Crusaders who sacked Constantinople in 1204 spread tales of Byzantine treachery to justify looting the richest city on earth. Enlightenment thinkers obsessed with classical Rome framed Byzantium as a cautionary tale of Christian superstition. Even the name Byzantine itself was a dismissive label invented later. Its citizens always called themselves Romans. The empire's real sin wasn't weakness. It was being too successful, too different, and too resilient to fit neatly into Europe's origin story. The truth is, Byzantium didn't fall because it rotted from within. It fell because it stood too long, a 1,000-year bulwark against invasions that would have crushed lesser states. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, its last emperor died sword in hand on the walls, defending not just a city, but a civilization that had kept the flame of antiquity alive through the darkest centuries. That's not decadence, that's endurance, and it's time we gave Byzantium the credit it earned. The myth of the lost cause might be one of history's most successful and dangerous rewrites. After the Civil War, a powerful narrative took root that the Confederacy fought not for slavery, but for states' rights and Southern honor, that its soldiers were outnumbered heroes defending a noble way of life. That reconstruction was a tragic era of Northern oppression rather than a bid for racial justice. This story was crafted so meticulously that it seeped into textbooks, statues, and even blockbuster films. But here's the hard truth. Every piece of it was a lie, carefully designed to hide slavery's central role and justify decades of oppression under a veneer of nostalgia. Start with the cornerstone claim that the war wasn't about slavery. The Confederacy's own words demolish this. Mississippi's secession declaration bluntly stated its reason. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. South Carolina's leaders railed against northern states refusing to return escaped enslaved people. Alexander Stephens, the Confederacy's vice president, called slavery the cornerstone of their new nation. These weren't secret documents, they were public proclamations unambiguous in their purpose. Yet within years of the war's end, groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy began scrubbing the record, framing the conflict as a struggle over tariffs or northern aggression. Then came the glorification of figures like Robert E. Lee, transformed from a slave-owning general who ordered brutal punishments for escaped black people into a saintly defender of Virginia. Statues depicting him in noble poses popped up across the South, not in the 1860s, but decades later during the Jim Crow era. Their purpose: to reinforce white supremacy under the guise of heritage. Even the Confederate flag we recognize today wasn't the primary battle flag. It was revived in the 1940s and 50s as a symbol of resistance to civil rights. Perhaps the most insidious twist was the demonization of Reconstruction. Textbooks painted this period when Black Americans briefly held political office, built schools, and fought for equality as a time of carpetbagger corruption and black misrule. The reality, former Confederates waged a terror campaign through groups like the Ku Klux Klan, murdering elected officials and burning schools to maintain white dominance. The lost cause myth erased this violence, instead spinning tales of suffering Southern whites and incompetent freedmen. This wasn't just bias, it was propaganda designed to legitimize segregation and disenfranchisement. Modern historians have dismantled these claims, but the damage lingers. You can see it in the stubborn defense of Confederate monuments, in the persistence of plantation weddings romanticizing the antebellum South, even in arguments that slavery was a side issue to the war. The lost cause wasn't just about rewriting history, it was about controlling the future, ensuring that white supremacy could hide behind gallant imagery and faux grievance. Breaking this myth matters because history isn't just about the past, it's about who gets to shape the present. When we strip away the gauzy fiction of the lost cause, what's left is a harder, truer story of a rebellion fought to preserve human bondage and a nation that, even in defeat, found ways to keep inequality alive. The real tragedy isn't a noble South that never existed, it's how long we believed in one. The idea that Native American societies were primitive before European contact is one of history's most persistent and damaging misconceptions. Far from simple hunter-gatherers wandering untamed wilderness, indigenous peoples across the Americas built sprawling cities, engineered landscapes, and cultivated knowledge systems so advanced they continue to astonish researchers today. Take Cahokia, the massive metropolis that flourished near modern-day St. Louis around 1000 AD. At its peak, it housed 20,000 people, more than London at the time, with a central plaza larger than 35 football fields aligned precisely to solar events. The city's engineers constructed enormous earthen mounds, one reaching 100 feet high, using millions of baskets of soil moved without wheels or beasts of burden. This wasn't just a village, it was the heart of a sophisticated civilization with trade networks stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Then there's the agricultural genius of the so-called Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash, a revolutionary farming system developed over millennia. Indigenous plant breeders transformed a wild grass called teosinte into high-yield maize through selective cultivation, a feat of genetic engineering long before the term existed. The Haudenosaunee perfected crop rotation and companion planting, with beans fixing nitrogen in the soil to nourish the corn while squash leaves shaded out weeds. These techniques produced surplus harvests that supported permanent settlements, contradicting the myth of nomadic tribes perpetually on the brink of starvation. By the time Europeans arrived, the Americas held more cultivated land than all of Europe, with terraced fields in the Andes and irrigation canals in the Sonoran Desert that still function today. Diplomacy, too, reached heights Europeans often misunderstood. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, founded around the 12th century, united 5 nations under the Great Law of Peace, a constitution that inspired Benjamin Franklin's ideas for federalism. Their democratic council system required unanimous decisions, with women holding veto power over war declarations. Meanwhile, the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia governed 60 towns through a complex tribute and alliance network that Captain John Smith described as a kingdom greater than any in Europe. These weren't loose bands of warriors, they were thriving polities with legal codes, ambassadors, and conflict resolution protocols that put many contemporary European states to shame. Perhaps most striking is the ecological mastery modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Indigenous fire management shaped entire ecosystems, from the oak savannas of California to the berry meadows of the Pacific Northwest. In the Amazon, researchers have uncovered terra preta, fertile, engineered soils enriched with charcoal and compost that still support crops centuries later. The Maya practiced intensive wetland agriculture, constructing raised fields that produced harvests 3 times more productive than modern techniques. Far from living in untouched wilderness, Native Americans sculpted their environments with precision, creating landscapes Europeans mistakenly perceived as natural. So why did the primitive myth take root? Because recognizing these achievements would have undermined the colonial project. Empty lands were easier to seize than thriving civilizations. Wilderness was simpler to claim than managed ecosystems, and savages needed saving, equals demanded treaties, but the truth is written in the earth itself, in the remnants of roads connecting Choco Canyon's astronomical observatories, in the fish weir still visible in New England rivers, in the 1,000-year-old chocolate residue found in Pueblo pottery. These weren't the marks of simple people, they were the fingerprints of cultures that saw further, planned deeper, and understood their world in ways we're only beginning to rediscover. The real primitivism wasn't in indigenous societies, it was in our failure to see them for what they truly were. The Ming dynasty often gets slapped with the label isolationist, a supposedly closed-off empire that turned its back on the world after a few flashy voyages. But that stereotype ignores one of history's greatest ironies. The same dynasty famous for building the Great Wall was also running the most ambitious maritime expeditions the world had ever seen. From 1405 to 1433, Admiral Zheng, his treasure fleet, some with over 300 ships, sailed from China to East Africa, bristling with diplomats, merchants, and enough firepower to topple kingdoms. These weren't just sightseeing tours. They were floating superpower statements, projecting Ming influence across the Indian Ocean, while Europe was still figuring out how to sail past the Azores. Those voyages alone should shatter the isolation myth, but there's more. Even after the emperors recalled the fleets, Ming China didn't retreat into a shell. Its silver economy became the engine of global trade. Spanish galleons hauled tons of New World silver from Acapulco to Manila, where Chinese merchants swapped it for silk, porcelain, and tea, creating history's first truly global currency market. By the late 16th century, up to half the world's silver supply wound up in Ming coffers, fueling an economic boom that made cities like Suzhou the envy of the planet. This wasn't isolation, it was globalization centuries before the term existed. Then there's the diplomatic chessboard. While textbooks fixate on the Great Wall, Ming emperors were hosting ambassadors from as far as Bengal and Samarkand. The Yongle Emperor didn't just send Zheng He abroad, he welcomed the Sultan of Melindi's giraffe as a tribute gift, paraded it through Beijing, and immortalized it in court paintings. Later Ming rulers maintained a tributary system that was less about conquest and more about a vast, sophisticated trade network disguised as diplomacy. Japanese daimyo, Vietnamese kings, and even the Timurids sent envoys not because they feared Ming armies, but because access to Chinese markets meant wealth and prestige. Even the so-called Heijin sea bans weren't about rejecting the outside world. They were targeted measures to curb piracy and smuggling, something every maritime power from Venice to England struggled with. Private trade flourished anyway, often with local officials turning a blind eye. When the Portuguese showed up in the 1500s, they didn't find a locked door. They cut deals with provincial governors, leasing Macau as a trading post while the Ming court looked the other way. The real story here isn't about a dynasty that closed its doors. It's about an empire so confident in its centrality that it saw no need to conquer abroad. The Ming didn't isolate, they curated, picking and choosing how to engage with a world they knew revolved around them. That's the twist historians now recognize. What looked like retreat was really the arrogance of a civilization that believed, not without reason, that the world would come to it. And for centuries it did. The Black Death didn't just crash into medieval Europe like a meteor, it crept in slowly, riding the same trade routes that had made the continent wealthy. For years, historians painted 1347 as year zero for the plague, as if the devastation began the moment Geno's ships docked in Messina with dead sailors aboard. But the truth is far more complex. The pandemic had been simmering for decades, perhaps centuries. It spread turbocharged by two invisible forces: globalization before the term existed, and a climate crisis nobody at the time understood. Long before the infamous death ships reached Italy, the plague Bacillus yersinia pestis was hitchhiking across Asia. Recent DNA studies reveal it likely emerged in the Tian Shan Mountains near Kyrgyzstan around 1338. Not as a freak mutation, but as part of a longer dance between rodents, fleas, and human settlements. From there, it traveled along the Silk Road, hopping from marmot fur in Mongol trade caravans to grain sacks in Crimean ports. The Mongol Empire's very success, its vast network of roads and relay stations, became the plague's superhighway. When the Golden Horde besieged the Genoese port of Kaffa in 1346, they didn't just catapult infected corpses over the walls, though that gruesome tactic probably happened. They accelerated a process already in motion, pushing merchants and their stowaway fleas onto ships headed west. Then there's the climate factor. Tree rings and ice cores tell us the early 14th century was a time of wild weather swings, the tail end of the medieval warm period giving way to the Little Ice Age. Crops failed, famine spread, malnourished populations became perfect prey for disease. In England, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed millions, hollowing out villages a generation before the plague arrived. Weak bodies, crowded slums, and collapsing sanitation created a tinderbox. The Black Death didn't ignite the fire, it simply landed in a world already soaked in gasoline. Even the plague's timeline defies the sudden myth. While the 1347 explosion gets all the attention, outbreaks had been flickering for years. In Central Asia, Nestorian Christian graves from 1338 bear inscriptions blaming pestilence. Venetian merchants wrote of strange illnesses in Crimea years before the siege of Kaffa. When the plague finally reached Europe, it didn't hit all at once. It pulsed in waves, with some towns spared entirely while others lost 90% of their people. The difference: local conditions. Cities with quarantine measures like Milan fared better. Isolated mountain villages sometimes escaped untouched. This wasn't a mindless hurricane of death. It was a disaster shaped by human choices, from trade policies to hygiene habits. The real lesson here isn't just about the plague, it's about how we misunderstand contagion. We crave simple, patient, zero narratives, but pandemics are always layered events, born from ecological shifts, economic networks, and societal blind spots. The Black Death didn't come out of nowhere, it came from everywhere, a dark shadow of the interconnected world medieval people had worked so hard to build. And that's what makes it so terrifyingly modern. The word feudal conjures images of a perfect pyramid, kings at the top, nobles in the middle, and downtrodden peasants crushed at the bottom, all locked into immovable roles by divine decree. But real medieval societies were far messier, more dynamic, and often more surprising than that neat flowchart suggests. Scratch beneath the surface, and you'll find peasants negotiating rights, nobles going bankrupt, and entire regions where feudalism barely took root. The myth of a uniform feudal system says more about modern obsession with order than it does about the chaotic, inventive realities of medieval life. Start with the idea of a rigid hierarchy. While kings technically owned the land, their power often stopped at the nearest river or forest. In places like medieval Catalonia, peasant farmers known as remenses held hereditary rights to their plots, paying fixed rents instead of being bound to the soil. By the 12th century, some were even selling their land or passing it to heirs, rights unheard of in textbook feudalism. Meanwhile, in parts of Germany and Italy, free cities blossomed where merchants and guilds answered to no lord but the emperor, an emperor who might be hundreds of miles away and powerless to intervene. These weren't exceptions, they were proof that feudalism was less a universal system and more a patchwork of local deals, some favoring lords, some favoring laborers. Then there's the myth of peasant helplessness. Medieval court records reveal shockingly bold commoners. In England, villagers routinely sued their lords over unfair fines or encroachments on grazing rights, and sometimes won. When the abbot of Ramsey tried to raise rents in 1391, his tenants organized a rent strike, withholding payments until he backed down. Even serfs had leverage. A lord reliant on their labor couldn't afford to push them too far, especially after the Black Death wiped out half of Europe's workforce and made skilled peasants a hot commodity. The result: higher wages, better contracts, and some serfs literally buying their freedom. This wasn't a static underclass, it was a constant negotiation. Social mobility was another reality glossed over by old textbooks. Take the Paston family of Norfolk, a clan of yeoman farmers who, within 2 generations, married into nobility, acquired a castle, and produced a knight. Or consider the ministerials of Germany, unfree knights who rose to govern castles and even advise emperors. The church, too, was a ladder. Boys from peasant families could become bishops or popes, like the son of a carpenter who became Pope Urban IV. The idea that everyone knew their place collapses under these stories. Regional differences were even starker. Compare Normandy, where feudalism arrived fully formed with William the Conqueror's invading army, to Scandinavia, where freeholding farmers dominated well into the Middle Ages. In Iceland, the Althing Assembly let chieftains jockey for power without castles or titles, while in parts of Spain, Muslim and Christian systems overlapped, creating hybrid land agreements that baffled French lawyers. Even the classic knight's fee, the idea that all land was granted in exchange for military service, falls apart when you see Italian nobles paying cash instead of sending soldiers, or English magnates hiring mercenaries so they could stay home. So why did the uniform feudalism myth take hold? Because it's tidy. 19th century historians, eager to frame the Middle Ages as a dark prelude to modern progress, smoothed out the wrinkles. Nationalists loved it too. French scholars emphasized loyalty to the crown, while Germans romanticized knightly codes, but the reality was always more fluid. Peasants schemed, lords compromised, rules bent, and that's the real lesson here. The past was never as simple as we want it to be. The next time someone describes feudalism as a pyramid, remember, it was less a monument and more a bustling marketplace of power, always under construction. Medieval peasants weren't the illiterate, downtrodden rustics we often picture. Behind the straw hats and muddy boots lay minds sharper than many modern stereotypes suggest. Recent studies of village records, court rolls, and even graffiti reveal a world where peasants negotiated contracts, argued law like lawyers, and participated in vibrant local cultures that defied their so-called simplicity. Take the humble court rolls from English manors like Hales Owen or Broughton. These documents show peasants citing legal precedent to challenge their lords over land rights, appealing to custom like seasoned attorneys. When the abbot of Ramsey tried to enclose common grazing land in 1320, his tenants didn't bow their heads. They banded together, hired a scribe, and sued him, citing ancient charters to prove their claim. This wasn't blind obedience, it was savvy, strategic resistance. Literacy, too, was more widespread than we've been led to believe. While formal education was rare, village life demanded functional reading skills. Peasants kept accounts, passed leases, and even penned petitions. In Norfolk, the Paston family letters written by 15th century farmers burst with gossip, legal advice, and sharp political commentary. Then there's the graffiti. Carved into church pews and barn beams, you'll find everything from merchants' tallies to snippets of poetry, proving that the written word wasn't just for monks and nobles. Some of the most poignant examples come from medieval pilgrims who scratched their names and prayers into cathedral walls, leaving behind traces of personal devotion that echo across centuries. Cultural participation went far beyond folk dances and tavern songs. Peasants staged mystery plays so elaborate they required months of rehearsal, with whole towns collaborating on biblical pageants that blurred the line between sacred and street theater. In York and Chester, these productions weren't amateur hour, they were community spectacles with sophisticated scripts, costumes, and special effects funded by trade guilds. And let's not forget music. The lute like gittan and portable pipe and tabor instruments appear in manuscripts showing villagers playing at weddings and fairs, while carols like Adam lay Ibounden reveal a rich oral tradition blending faith and folklore. The real kicker, peasants often knew more about the wider world than we assume. Pilgrimage routes brought them into contact with people from distant lands, while bustling market towns buzzed with news from traveling merchants. When the Canterbury Tales Miller and Reeve trade insults about each other's home regions, it's not just comedy, it's proof of lively regional identities and a keen awareness of geography. Even agriculture was a science. Medieval farmers practiced crop rotation centuries before it was discovered by Enlightenment thinkers, and treatises like Walter of Henley's Husbandry show them debating soil chemistry and livestock breeding with startling sophistication. So why does the ignorant peasant myth endure? Because history is often written by those with the loudest voices, monks chronicling battles, nobles commissioning tapestries. The quiet competence of everyday people slips through the cracks, but dig a little deeper and you'll find a medieval countryside alive with argument, artistry, and ingenuity. These weren't passive victims of feudalism. They were its negotiators, its loophole finders, and sometimes its quiet revolutionaries. The next time someone dismisses the Middle Ages as a time of dumb drudgery, remember, the past was full of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, even if they left their signatures in the margins. The Industrial Revolution wasn't some unstoppable force of nature, a predetermined destiny waiting to unfold in 18th century Britain. For generations, textbooks framed it as an inevitable outcome of European ingenuity, as if steam engines and spinning jennies were destined to burst forth like ripe fruit from the tree of progress. But peel back that deterministic narrative, and you'll find a far messier reality, one where chance, global exploitation, and forgotten alternatives shape the path to modernity. Consider the ingredients often credited for Britain's industrial leap: coal deposits, colonial wealth, and a culture of invention. Yet China had burned coal for centuries, Mughal India produced textiles finer than anything in Manchester, and Dutch scientists were tinkering with steam power decades before James Watt. What set Britain apart wasn't some monopoly on innovation, but a brutal confluence of circumstances. The transatlantic slave trade funneled capital into ports like Liverpool and Bristol, financing factories. Enclosure Acts pushed dispossessed farmers into cities, creating a desperate workforce. And when Indian cotton threatened British mills, Parliament slapped on tariffs so steep they crippled competitors, an early case of economic protectionism dressed as free market triumph. This wasn't destiny, it was a rigged game. Historians now trace industrialism's roots beyond Europe's borders. Caribbean sugar plantations operated like proto-factories with brutal efficiency and division of labor that predated assembly lines. West African metallurgists smelted iron in advanced furnaces that rivaled Sheffield's. Even the supposedly backward Ottoman Empire had craft guilds producing goods at scales that stunned European visitors. The Industrial Revolution didn't emerge in a vacuum. It fed on resources, ideas, and labor stripped from across the globe, then claimed credit for the spoils. The greatest myth of all, that industrialization had to look like Britain's hellish smokestacks and child laborers. Alternative paths flickered briefly but were crushed. In Bengal, artisans using traditional handlooms outproduced British machines until the East India Company destroyed their markets and severed their thumbs to prevent revival. In Japan, the Meiji government deliberately avoided colonial-style exploitation, investing in education and small-scale workshops that avoided the worst horrors of Manchester's slums. Even in Britain itself, Luddites weren't just machine-smashing reactionaries, they were skilled workers fighting for a humane pace of production, one that didn't sacrifice lives at the altar of efficiency. So why does the inevitable myth persist? Because it lets us off the hook. If industrialization was destiny, then its collateral damage, enslavement, pollution, dispossession, becomes tragic but unavoidable. But history offers no such comfort. The factories rose because empires made choices to plunder rather than partner, to exploit rather than collaborate. Recognizing that truth doesn't diminish the revolution's achievements, it forces us to confront the costs buried beneath its towering chimneys. And perhaps that's the real lesson here: progress isn't a straight line. It's a maze of might-have-beens where every turn taken means a path left unexplored. The past wasn't inevitable, and neither is the future. The Silk Road wasn't a single dusty trail winding through deserts and mountains. It was a sprawling, chaotic web of trade routes, shifting with the seasons, politics, and the whims of bandits and middlemen. The romantic image of camel caravans trudging along one continuous path from Rome to China is a modern fantasy. In reality, goods changed hands dozens of times before reaching their final destinations, passed between merchants who might never travel more than a few hundred miles. Silk leaving Xi'an could be traded to Sogdian middlemen in Samarkand, then sold to Persian dealers in Merv, before finally reaching a Venetian buyer in Constantinople. Each leg of the journey adding markup so steep that by the time Chinese porcelain reached Europe, its price rivaled gold. What made the Silk Road work wasn't just geography, it was a vast ecosystem of intermediaries. Sogdian merchants, often forgotten in textbook accounts, were the backbone of Central Asian trade, fluent in multiple languages and adept at navigating the rivalries between empires. Nestorian Christian monks doubled as translators, Buddhist monasteries functioned as banks, and Jewish Radhanite traders connected Europe to the Abbasid Caliphate. Even the Mongols, often portrayed as destroyers, became meticulous administrators under Genghis Khan, securing routes so safe that travelers boasted a maiden with a golden tray could walk from one end of the empire to the other unmolested. The Silk Road thrived because it was a patchwork of networks, not a monopoly controlled by any one power. The diversity of goods traded shatters another myth that this was solely a highway for silk and spices. Russian furs, Baltic amber, and Afghan lapis lazuli moved east, while paper-making technology, stirrups, and even musical instruments flowed west. A single archaeological dig in Mongolia uncovered a trove of Roman glassware, Indian beads, and Persian silverware buried in a nomad's grave. The Silk Road wasn't just about commerce, it was a conveyor belt for ideas. Buddhism traveled from India to China on these routes, and Greek medical texts found their way to Arabic scholars who later passed them to Europe. Even the humble playing card likely evolved from Chinese paper games introduced to the Islamic world via Silk Road traders. Modern archaeology has upended old assumptions about who controlled the trade. For centuries, historians focused on empires Rome, Han China, Persia, but now we know nomadic groups like the Yuezhi and Xiongnu played pivotal roles. The Turpan Oasis, a pit stop in today's Xinjiang, reveals tax receipts showing Sogdian merchants paying duties to local Uyghur rulers, not distant emperors. And in the Taklamakan Desert, buried cities like Nia have yielded documents in a dozen scripts from Brahmi to Aramaic, proving the Silk Road was less a highway than a crowded marketplace where no single culture held sway. The real Silk Road defies simple storytelling. It wasn't Marco Polo's solo adventure. It was countless unnamed traders, translators, and travelers, each adding a stitch to the tapestry. Those romantic caravans, they were just the visible threads in a fabric woven from thousands of smaller journeys, deals, and chance encounters. And that's the true wonder of the Silk Road. Not that it connected east and west, but that it reminds us how deeply intertwined they've always been, long before globalization became a buzzword. The routes may have faded, but the legacy lingers in everything from the noodles on your plate to the numbers in your math textbook, all whispering the same truth: no civilization ever truly stands alone. The so-called decline of the Islamic Golden Age is one of history's most misleading labels. A narrative that suggests the light suddenly flickered out across the Muslim world, plunging it into some long intellectual darkness. But the truth is far more nuanced. While political power shifted and empires fragmented, the flow of scientific inquiry, artistic innovation, and economic vitality didn't just stop. It transformed, adapted, and in many cases outlasted the very dynasties that once sponsored it. Take astronomy. Long after the Abbasid Caliphate's heyday, the Maraghe Observatory in 13th century Persia boasted instruments so precise they inspired Copernicus centuries later. Mathematicians like Al-Kashi, working in Samarkand's Ulugh Beg Observatory, calculated pi to 16 decimal places, a record untouched for over 150 years. And let's not forget the enduring legacy of Ibn al-Shatir, whose models of planetary motion bore uncanny resemblance to those later drafted by Kepler. These weren't dying embers of a bygone era. They were sparks igniting new trails of discovery. Economically, the Islamic world kept thriving in ways historians often overlook. While Europe struggled through the Black Death, Mamluk Egypt was running what we'd now call a proto-industrial economy, with textile workshops in Damascus producing linen and silk at scales that dwarfed European output. The city of Aleppo became a global hub for dyed fabrics, its souks buzzing with Venetian merchants willing to pay premium prices. Even as political unity fractured, trade networks held strong. Jewish merchant letters from the Cairo Geniza reveal intricate connections stretching from Spain to India, with credit systems so sophisticated they'd make a modern banker nod in respect. Culturally, the decline myth collapses entirely under the weight of evidence. Persian poets like Hafez and Rumi weren't just preserving tradition, they were reinventing it, crafting verses that resonate worldwide today. The Ottoman Empire's Suleymaniye complex in Istanbul wasn't a mere imitation of past glories. Its architect Sinan pioneered dome techniques that pushed engineering limits. And in Mughal India, Akbar's court fused Persian, Hindu, and European influences into a renaissance of miniature painting and literature that defies any simplistic narrative of decay. So why does the abrupt collapse story persist? Partly because Western historians, eager to frame the Renaissance as Europe's triumphant awakening, needed a foil, a conveniently dark Muslim world against which their own progress could shine. But dig deeper and you'll find continuity everywhere. The same medical texts that Ibn Sina wrote in the 11th century remained standard teaching material in European universities well into the 17th. The astrolabes perfected by Islamic craftsmen guided sailors across oceans long after the caliphates fell. Even coffee, that quintessential Islamic contribution, was just beginning its global conquest as the so-called Golden Age ended. The real story isn't one of rise and fall, but of evolution. Knowledge didn't vanish, it migrated, blending into new contexts from Andalusia to the Deccan. What we call decline was often just decentralization, with innovation flourishing in smaller courts, trading cities, and scholarly circles far from the old imperial capitals. And perhaps that's the most important lesson here. Greatness isn't a single moment frozen in time. It's a current, sometimes visible, sometimes subterranean, but never truly gone. The Islamic Golden Age didn't end. It simply changed form, leaving fingerprints on the modern world that we're still learning to recognize. History loves its stereotypes, and few are more persistent than the idea of premodern women as silent spectators, delicate flowers confined to hearths and harems while men shaped the world. But dig beneath the surface, and you'll find warrior queens debating philosophers, pirate admirals commanding fleets, and scholars whose work revolutionized fields from medicine to mathematics. Take Enheduanna, the world's first named author, a Sumerian high priestess who composed hymns in 2300 B.C.E., her verses echoing louder than the kings who tried to erase her. Or Empress Lu Zhai of China, who ruled the Han dynasty with such ruthless brilliance that historians labeled her a villainess for daring to govern like a man. From Byzantine Princess Anna Komnene, whose Alexiad remains the definitive account of the First Crusade, to the Nzinga of Ndongo, who outmaneuvered Portuguese slavers for decades, women weren't just present in history, they were rewriting its rules. Consider the forgotten scientific pioneers. While Hypatia of Alexandria's murder by a Christian mob is well known, fewer recognize Mariam al-Astrolabi, the 10th century Syrian woman who perfected the astrolabe, a device so critical to navigation that Columbus likely used a descendant of her design. In medieval Spain, Lubna of Cordoba served as chief librarian of the Umayyad Caliphate, overseeing a collection of 500,000 volumes while tutoring princes in poetry and astronomy. And let's not forget Taputi Belait Kalam, a Babylonian perfume maker cited in clay tablets from 1200 B.C.E., history's first recorded chemist distilling flowers and resins with precision that would stump modern perfumers. These women weren't anomalies, they were part of a tapestry of female intellect systematically unpicked by later historians who preferred their heroines saintly or silent. Then there are the rebels who shattered systems. The Trong sisters of 1st century Vietnam didn't just resist Chinese invaders. They raised an army of 80,000, including 36 female generals, and ruled independently for 3 years. In 17th century Angola, Queen Ana de Sousa Nzinga turned her kingdom into a fortress against the transatlantic slave trade, negotiating as equals with Dutch and Portuguese emissaries while fielding armies in battles that stretched for decades. Even in Victorian England, where women were supposedly relegated to parlours, Elena Marx organized labor unions and translated Madame Bovary while her father Karl scribbled in the British Museum. The myth of passive women persists because it served those writing the histories. When Nur Jahan ruled the Mughal Empire in all but name, issuing imperial decrees and designing Lahore's gardens, chroniclers downplayed her power, framing her as a manipulative wife rather than a sovereign. When Christine de Pizan penned the Book of the City of Ladies in 1405, skewering sexist myths with razor-sharp logic, male peers dismissed her as shrill. But the evidence was always there, hidden in marginalia, whispered in letters, etched into the artifacts they left behind. A Viking grave in Birka, once assumed to hold a warrior, was revealed by DNA testing to belong to a woman surrounded by swords and strategy boards. A fresco in Pompeii shows a female philosopher lecturing male students, her scroll unfurled in confidence. Rediscovering these stories isn't just about fairness, it's about accuracy. History wasn't a stage where men alone held the spotlight. It was a crowded, chaotic drama where women built empires, advanced science, and waged wars, only to have their roles diminished by generations of historians who couldn't imagine such agency. But the cracks in that narrative are widening. With every overlooked manuscript decoded, every burial site re-examined, we're piecing together a past far more vibrant and far more true than the one we've been told. The real question isn't why we forgot these women. It's why we ever assumed they weren't there to begin with. The Roman Empire wasn't the monolithic, smoothly run machine we often imagine. Beneath the marble facades and triumphant arches lurked a patchwork of cultures, languages, and local loyalties that frequently bucked against central control. Take the so-called Romanization of conquered territories, a term that suggests a tidy, top-down imposition of Latin and togas. In reality, Gauls, Egyptians, and Syrians didn't simply trade their identities for Roman ones. They blended them, creating hybrid cultures that resisted imperial homogenization. In Britain, archaeologists find Celtic deities carved with Roman-style inscriptions. In Palmyra, a desert oasis city, leaders like Queen Zenobia fused Roman military titles with Aramaic traditions, crafting a regional power so strong it briefly broke away entirely in the 3rd century. The empire didn't erase local pride, it coexisted with it, sometimes uneasily. Even the vaunted Roman bureaucracy was less a well-oiled machine and more a tangled web of competing interests. Provincial governors often ruled like mini-dictators, skimming taxes and ignoring distant emperors. Corruption scandals erupted frequently, like the 1st century governor Gaius Verres, whose extortion in Sicily was so brazen Cicero wrote entire speeches about his crimes. And when emperors tried to tighten control, rebellions flared. The Batavian Revolt in 69 AD saw Germanic auxiliaries, once loyal Roman soldiers, turn against their commanders, exploiting civil war chaos to carve out an independent state. This wasn't an isolated incident. From the Jewish revolts in Judea to the Baghdadi peasant uprisings in Gaul, the empire's edges were always fraying. Language, too, fractured the illusion of unity. While Latin dominated the West, Greek remained the lingua franca in the East, and pockets of Punic, Coptic, and Syriac persisted for centuries. Legal documents from places like Roman Egypt reveal a staggering diversity: Greek contracts alongside Egyptian marriage customs, Roman wills modified by local traditions. Even the army, often portrayed as a melting pot, segregated units by ethnicity, with Syrian archers and Dalmatian cavalry serving under their own officers. The empire didn't assimilate, it negotiated, bending its rules to accommodate the very differences it couldn't erase. Perhaps the most telling fracture was religion. Long before Christianity's rise, the empire teamed with competing cults: Mithraism in military barracks, Isis worship in port cities, and underground Jewish communities preserving their faith. When emperors like Decius tried enforcing empire-wide sacrifices to restore unity, it backfired spectacularly, sparking resistance from Christians and traditionalists alike. The empire's strength wasn't in uniformity, but in its ability to stretch sometimes to the breaking point around 1,000 local realities. So why the myth of seamless unity? Because empires need origin stories, Augustus and his successors sold the idea of Pax Romana, a golden age of order, to legitimize their rule. Later historians, dazzled by Rome's longevity, mistaken its flexibility for cohesion. But the cracks were always there, visible in the graffiti of Pompeii mocking politicians, in the letters of soldiers complaining about pay, in the tombstones of immigrants clinging to hometown gods. The Roman Empire didn't fall because it lost its unity. It fell because it never really had it, and that's what made its centuries of improvisation so remarkable. The real genius of Rome wasn't in ruling a monolith. It was in keeping the pieces together long enough for the world to mistake them for one. The pyramids of Egypt weren't built by whipped slaves under the crack of a taskmaster's whip. That's a myth etched into pop culture by Hollywood and outdated textbooks. The truth, these colossal monuments were the work of highly skilled laborers, paid in beer, bread, and social prestige, operating within a society where construction was as much about national unity as it was about engineering. Recent archaeological discoveries at Giza's worker villages like Hayt el Ghurab reveal bakeries capable of feeding thousands, medical clinics treating fractures with splints, and even payroll records etched in hieratic script. These weren't prisoners, they were craftsmen who took pride in their work, leaving graffiti like "Friends of Khufu's crew" on limestone blocks, signatures of a workforce bonded by purpose, not chains. The idea of the pyramids emerging from some stagnant, unchanging tradition also crumbles under scrutiny. Look closely and you'll see a story of trial, error, and relentless innovation. The Step Pyramid of Djoser, Egypt's first, began as a simple mastaba before Imhotep, history's first named architect, stacked 6 layers in a daring leap of design. At Meidum, an early smooth-sided pyramid collapsed catastrophically, its rubble still visible today like a fossilized failure. Even the Great Pyramid itself shows adjustments mid-construction, chambers relocated, passageways rerouted, proving these weren't cookie-cutter projects. Each pharaoh's monument pushed boundaries, with engineers refining ramp systems, quarrying techniques, and precision leveling to near miraculous degrees. A single casing stone from the Great Pyramid, when examined, fits its neighbor with a gap of just 0.5 millimeter, a testament to craftsmanship that would challenge modern masons. But the real revelation lies in the pyramid's political role. They weren't just tombs, they were the ancient equivalent of economic stimulus packages. During the Nile's annual floods, when farming stalled, pyramid projects put idle hands to work, redistributing wealth through labor. Farmers became stonemasons, scribes kept inventories, and priests managed logistics. A societal machine that kept Egypt stable for centuries. The pyramids, in this light, weren't vanity projects. They were the glue of civilization, binding people to a shared mission under the banner of divine kingship. So why did the slave myth persist? Blame Herodotus, the Greek historian who spun tales of oppressed masses in 500 BCE, his accounts colored by later cultures that relied on forced labor. Modern Egyptology, armed with tools like 3D scanning and osteoarchaeology, tells a different story. Skeletons from worker cemeteries show signs of healed injuries and robust nutrition, not the trauma expected of slaves. Papyri like the diary of Mura detail crews delivering limestone blocks with military precision, their shifts carefully logged like a Bronze Age timesheet. The pyramids don't just stand as monuments to the dead. They're a testament to the living, to the architects who dreamed audaciously, the laborers who carved immortality from stone, and the society that turned a pharaoh's whim into a national project. To call them slave-built isn't just inaccurate. It steals credit from the hands that actually raised them, hands that left fingerprints in the mortar, proving the real magic wasn't in the mystery, but in the sheer, coordinated effort of thousands who believed they were building for eternity. Indigenous Australian cultures have long been misrepresented as frozen in time, unchanging relics of a primitive past, untouched by innovation or adaptation. But nothing could be further from the truth. For over 65,000 years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples didn't just survive Australia's extremes. They reshaped them, responding to climatic upheavals and ecological challenges with ingenuity that rewrites our understanding of human resilience. Consider the archaeological record at sites like Majidbeb in Arnhem Land, where layers of tools, pigments, and grinding stones reveal not stagnation, but a dynamic evolution in technology. Early stone axes gave way to finely honed adzes. Rock art shifted from ochre handprints to intricate cross-hatch designs narrating sea level rises and the arrival of new species. This wasn't a static culture, it was a living laboratory of experimentation. Climate change posed one of the greatest tests. During the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago, when much of Australia turned to arid desert, indigenous groups didn't retreat, they adapted. In the Willandra Lakes region, communities engineered sophisticated fish traps and eel farms to harness dwindling water resources. When rising seas drowned ancient coastlines after the Ice Age, oral traditions like those of the Gunditjmara preserved detailed memories of submerged landscapes, guiding navigation and resource use for generations. Rock art in the Kimberley depicts now extinct megafauna like Thylacoleo, suggesting careful observation and documentation of ecological shifts over millennia. These weren't passive victims of their environment, they were its analysts and architects. The myth of an unchanging Australia also crumbles when examining agricultural practices. Far from relying solely on foraging, groups like the Yolngu in the north cultivated yams through selective burning and soil enrichment, while the Tiwi Islanders practiced orchid farming to sustain permanent settlements. In Victoria, the Gunditjmara's engineered wetland systems channeling water through volcanic stone to farm eels rivaled the scale of ancient Mesopotamian irrigation. Even the iconic fire stick farming, often dismissed as simple hunting, was a precision tool. By burning in mosaic patterns, indigenous custodians boosted biodiversity, encouraging grassland for kangaroos while protecting fire-sensitive species. A land management technique modern ecologists now advocate to prevent catastrophic wildfires. Cultural adaptation extended beyond survival. When Makassar traders from Sulawesi began visiting northern Australia around 1700, indigenous communities didn't resist, they integrated. Scroll paintings from Yurukala show Makassar praus alongside traditional canoes, while words like rupaya for money entered local languages. This wasn't cultural erosion. It was selective adoption, blending new ideas with enduring traditions. Later, when British colonists arrived, Aboriginal trackers like Jandamara and Pemel leveraged their deep knowledge of terrain to mount resistance campaigns that outmaneuvered European forces for decades. The persistence of the unchanging native stereotype says more about colonial justifications than historical reality. If indigenous cultures were static, their displacement could be framed as inevitable progress over primitivism. But the evidence shouts otherwise, from the Brewerina fish traps still standing after 40,000 years to the revival of ancient fire practices saving modern towns from wildfires. Aboriginal innovation isn't locked in the past. It's a continuous thread woven through millennia of challenge and change. Recognizing this doesn't just correct the record, it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the most advanced societies aren't always the ones writing history. Sometimes they're the ones patiently adapting to its tides, leaving footprints too deep for time to erase. The image of Vikings as bloodthirsty berserkers rampaging across Europe is one of history's most enduring and misleading caricatures. While their raids were certainly violent, reducing Norse expansion to mindless plunder ignores the sophisticated economic and political strategies driving their movements. Recent archaeological discoveries and revised readings of sagas reveal a pattern far more calculated than chaos. These weren't random acts of piracy. They were targeted strikes timed to exploit vulnerabilities and engineered to fill specific needs back home. Take the infamous raid on Lindisfarne in 793, often painted as the opening shot of a barbarian onslaught. The isolated monastery wasn't chosen by accident. Its wealth silver reliquaries, jeweled gospels, was legendary, and its defenses were laughable compared to fortified towns. More importantly, the Vikings had likely gathered intelligence from traders who'd visited Northumbria's ports. This was no spontaneous eruption of violence. It was a high-reward, low-risk operation planned with the cold precision of a modern heist, but the real revelation lies in what followed the raids. Viking bands didn't just vanish with their loot, they leveraged it. Silver from England's monasteries financed trade networks stretching to Baghdad, where dirhams bearing Norse graffiti have been found. Captives taken from Ireland were sold in markets from Dublin to Novgorod, fueling a slave trade that connected the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. Even the terrifying Great Heathen Army of the 9th century, once portrayed as a mindless horde, now appears as a coalition of entrepreneurs settling land, exacting tribute the Danegeld, and eventually transitioning from raiders to rulers in places like York and Normandy. The political motives were equally nuanced. Back in Scandinavia, chieftains faced a crisis of inheritance. With lands divided among sons, younger siblings had to seek wealth abroad to build their own power bases. Raiding wasn't just profitable, it was a career path. Successful leaders like Rollo parlayed violence into legitimacy, carving out duchies recognized by kings they'd once terrorized. Meanwhile, in Norway, Harald Fairhair used plundered wealth to centralize power, proving that the line between warlord and monarch was often just a matter of perspective. Environment played a role too. The 8th century population boom in Scandinavia strained limited farmland, while advances in shipbuilding, like the keel and sail, made crossing the North Sea safer than staying home to starve. Even climate mattered. Tree rings from this period show unusually warm summers, allowing Vikings to reach Iceland, Greenland, and even Newfoundland not as raiders, but as settlers competing for turf with indigenous peoples like the Thule. The most startling twist: many Viking raids weren't even Norse-led. Genetic studies of burial sites reveal multicultural crews, Slavs, Frisians, and even Anglo-Saxons operating under the Viking brand. The term Viking wasn't an ethnicity, it was a job description, a seasonal occupation for farmers, fishermen, and adventurers looking to supplement their income. So why does the mindless violence myth persist? Because it's convenient. Medieval monks, the era's primary chroniclers, had every reason to paint invaders as godless monsters. Later nationalists romanticized Vikings as pure warrior stock to fuel their own ideologies. But the truth is far more interesting. These weren't demons or demigods, they were pragmatists responding to the same forces of scarcity, ambition, and opportunity that drive human behavior in any era. The next time you picture a Viking, don't imagine a screaming brute with a bloody axe. Imagine a trader weighing risks, a diplomat negotiating treaties, or a farmer hedging his bets against a bad harvest. That's the real story, not chaos but calculus. The Spanish conquest of the Aztecs wasn't the foregone conclusion history textbooks often make it seem. We've been sold this image of a handful of armored Spaniards toppling an empire with superior technology and divine favor. But the real story hinges on something far more fragile. A perfect storm of indigenous resentment, strategic miscalculations, and epidemiological luck that could have easily swung the other way. Start with the myth of Spanish invincibility. Cortés arrived in 1519 with fewer than 600 men, a laughable force against the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, a city of 200,000 with an army that could summon tens of thousands. What tipped the scales wasn't Spanish muskets or horses, but the willingness of Tlaxcalan warriors, long oppressed by Aztec tribute demands, to join the invaders. These weren't passive bystanders. The Tlaxcalans fielded 80,000 troops at the siege of Tenochtitlan, outnumbering Cortés's forces 100 to 1. Without them, the Spanish would have been crushed before they ever saw Moctezuma's palace. Disease often gets framed as the ultimate decider, but the timing was everything. Smallpox didn't ravage the Aztecs until after Cortés's first retreat in 1520, meaning the empire was still at full strength during initial battles. Even then, the epidemic's impact wasn't uniform. While Tenochtitlan suffered, Tlaxcala, thanks partly to Spanish allies isolating their own populations, retained enough warriors to keep fighting. This wasn't destiny, it was exploitation of chaos, with Cortés maneuvering between outbreaks like a gambler counting cards. Recent archaeology has upended old assumptions about Aztec weakness. Excavations at the Templo Mayor reveal stockpiles of obsidian blades sharper than surgical steel, capable of gutting a horse in one swipe. Spanish accounts themselves describe Aztec warriors dragging cannons off causeways with grappling hooks and adapting their tactics overnight. At the Battle of Otumba, where Cortés was nearly annihilated, it was only a desperate charge to kill the enemy commander, not technological superiority, that saved the Spanish. The most tantalizing what-if lies in Moctezuma's choices. Early interactions suggest he initially viewed the Spanish as diplomats, not conquerors, offering gold as tribute rather than mustering full resistance. Had he attacked Cortez's vulnerable column first sighting, or had his successor Cuauhtémoc's guerrilla tactics come sooner, the invasion might have ended in a matter of weeks. Even in defeat, Aztec resilience stunned the Spanish. Tenochtitlan held out for 80 days under siege, its canals choked with corpses but its warriors fighting street by street. The real lesson here isn't about inevitability, it's about contingency, the fragile moments where history balances on a knife's edge. The Aztecs didn't fall because they were backward or doomed. They fell because of alliances they couldn't break, a virus they couldn't predict, and decisions they couldn't rewind. And that's the danger of the inevitable narrative. It lets us forget how close it all came to unfolding differently, how a single choice, a single battle, might have reshaped the Americas forever. The Victorian era often gets painted as a dreary landscape of soot-choked cities, child labor, and stiff upper lips, a time when progress meant little more than corsets and colonialism. But this grim caricature overlooks a period of explosive innovation and reform that reshaped the modern world. Beneath the top hats and crinolines beat the pulse of a society wrestling with its future, making leaps in science, technology, and social justice that still echo today. Take medicine, where Victorian breakthroughs saved millions. Florence Nightingale didn't just comfort soldiers in the Crimean War, she pioneered statistical analysis to prove that sanitation, not fate, dictated survival rates. Her polar area diagrams showing deaths from preventable infections became the foundation of modern epidemiology. Meanwhile, Joseph Lister's antiseptic surgery transformed operating theaters from death traps into places of healing. Before his carbolic acid sprays, a simple broken bone could mean fatal gangrene. After, survival rates soared. Even mental health saw radical shifts, with reformers like John Connolly campaigning to replace chains and dungeons with humane treatment, though progress was messy and incomplete. Science didn't just advance in labs, it electrified everyday life. Michael Faraday's experiments with electromagnetism lit the path for Edison's bulbs, while Charles Babbage's analytical engine laid the conceptual groundwork for computers a century early. Mary Anning scrabbled over Lyme Regis cliffs, unearthing fossils that forced Europe to confront Earth's unimaginable age, her discoveries quietly undermining biblical literalism long before Darwin's Origin of Species. And speaking of Darwin, his voyage on the Beagle and subsequent theory of natural selection didn't just challenge religious dogma. They revolutionized biology, agriculture, and even how humans saw their place in the cosmos. Social reforms bloomed alongside technological ones. The Factory Acts of the 1840s and 50s, though imperfect, began regulating child labor and limiting workdays, responding to activists like Lord Shaftesbury, who documented toddlers toiling in coal mines. Literacy rates skyrocketed after the Education Act of 1870 made schooling compulsory, fueling a publishing boom that birthed everything from Dickens' serialized novels to Scientific American. Women, though still denied the vote, carved new spaces as writers, educators, and even doctors. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson became Britain's first female physician in 1865 after teaching herself medicine when universities barred her. Globally, the Victorians were anything but isolated. The telegraph shrank continents with the 1866 transatlantic cable linking London to New York in minutes, not weeks. Exhibitions like the Great Exhibition of 1851 showcased Japanese lacquerware alongside Sheffield steel, sparking cross-cultural design frenzies. Even colonialism, often framed as one-sided exploitation, had unexpected feedback loops. Indian textiles influenced English fashions, while Swahili porters and Aboriginal trackers became vital intermediaries in exploration and trade. The real Victorians were neither saints nor monsters, they were contradictions in motion. They built sewers to combat cholera while clinging to miasma theory. They abolished slavery while justifying empire. They romanticized medieval knights while inventing the modern world. Their era wasn't just a prelude to ours, it was the volatile laboratory where our own debates about progress, ethics, and global connection first took shape. The darkness we remember says less about their time than our own need for simple narratives, but history, like a Victorian novel, thrives in the messy, unresolved shades between. History isn't set in stone, it's a living conversation, constantly rewritten as new evidence emerges and old assumptions crumble. Every myth we've unraveled today, from Viking horned helmets to the Dark Ages, proves how easily stories harden into facts when we stop questioning them. But the past doesn't change, our understanding of it does. That's the thrilling paradox of history. The more we learn, the less certain we become. Think of how much has shifted just in your lifetime. 30 years ago, Neanderthals were still textbook cavemen. Now we know they painted caves and shared our DNA. A century back, the lost cause myth whitewashed Confederate motives. Today, their own documents indict them. Even recent events like the Cold War or the digital revolution are being reassessed as archives open and perspectives shift. The history you learned in school isn't wrong, it's incomplete. And that's okay. What matters is staying curious enough to keep asking, what if we've gotten this wrong? This isn't just about accuracy, it's about humility. When we treat history as a done deal, we miss its most valuable lesson, that human beings in every era are more complicated than the labels we give them. The medieval peasant wasn't just a faceless serf. The Aztec wasn't just a sacrificial priest, the Victorian wasn't just a stuffy aristocrat. They were people as nuanced and contradictory as we are, navigating their own tangled worlds. And somewhere in those tangles lie clues that might upend what we think we know tomorrow. So here's your invitation: don't just consume history, interrogate it. Seek out the footnotes, the dissenters, the inconvenient artifacts that don't fit the narrative. Because the next great historical correction might be hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone like you to question the old story. And if you love watching the past get a makeover, hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more myths to bust, and you won't want to miss when the next piece of the puzzle clicks into place. After all, history's greatest surprises are still out there, buried under layers of dust and dogma, ready to rewrite everything we thought we knew.